So please join me in giving a warm welcome for Claire Adida, who's going to speak today about engendering empathy, beginning backlash, attitudes towards Syrian refugees, another timely topic. All right, welcome to Claire Adida.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I really look forward to presenting this work and to getting your questions and your feedback. I should mention that this is we're in the pretty early stages of presenting our results, so your feedback will be particularly valuable. It's not like it's already coming out for publication. We could actually integrate your questions and feedback, so I really look forward to that. I also maybe should apologize. This is about the US. This is about American attitudes towards Syrian refugees. And this is very much a political science approach. You feel free to stop me and ask for any clarification questions at any moment. Okay, so this is also co-authored work with Adeline Lowe, a postdoc at Princeton University, a former student of mine, and with Melina Platas, who is assistant professor at NYU Abu Dhabi. Okay, so a little bit about the motivation. So we know research in a number of different disciplines, in psychology, political science, economics, has shown us just how easy it is for people to have prejudice against outgroups, people they don't consider to be a part of their group. And in political science, scholars have shown that this applies to how people feel about immigrants, and it applies to how people feel about refugees. So we know that individuals are easily driven to exclude others. There's a lot of research showing this. There's a lot of research showing that immigrants can become scapegoats in times of an economic crisis. So conflict with immigrants in Europe usually occurs against a background of economic competition for scarce resources. And we also know that when you threaten somebody's sense of cultural identity, of national identity, you can get them to express some pretty negative attitudes and opinions of immigrants. And that you can go pretty far in getting people to be excluding, even people who at the baseline aren't necessarily the most anti-immigrant in their attitudes. We also know, this is some other work that I've done, that politicians can easily leverage certain threats to create anti-immigrant response. And so this is work where we've shown that in the US, if you talk about the threat of Ebola, which was a crisis that occurred a couple years ago in West Africa mostly, and then came to the US, people will adopt more negative attitudes towards immigrants. So Ebola, immigrants, two unrelated topics can easily come together when politicians exploit a threat. So the question in this study is, all right, we know that we can create exclusion. Can we create inclusion instead? Can we get people to be more including of outgroups, and specifically of vulnerable minorities like refugees? So a little bit on the theoretical background. So this is not a new question. This dates back to ancient Greece. It was back then known as rhetoric. People still talk about this as rhetoric. And the question is, how do individuals exercise influence via communication? So here we're looking at methods of persuasion. How do you persuade someone to adopt different attitudes? And Aristotle has this really nice typology, this categorization of different mechanisms of persuasion, different ways in which you can persuade people. There's appeals you can make grounded in logic. So you're arguing, you're presenting facts, you're presenting an argument. There's appeals that you can make grounded in emotion. And then there's appeals that you can make grounded in the identity of the communicator. So a communicator with a certain authority, or a communicator who is an in-group, who is a co-ethnic of yours, for example, might persuade you more than a different kind of communicator. So we're going to use this typology to test what are some of the more effective messages to get people to to change people's attitudes towards Syrian refugees. In political science, there's not to my knowledge, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there's not a lot of work on persuasion in political science, and usually The work on persuasion in political science is work on getting out the vote. Can you get people to go vote? Or does media affect your partisanship? Right? And this is the literature that I know is very much US based. And so there is a call for a lot more work and a lot more experimental work, which is work where you can identify a causal relationship on how to reduce prejudice. So this is what we're trying to do. So our motivating case is the Syrian refugee crisis. So I have a number of points here for why this is important, and my co-author told me that I may not need to spend a lot of time on that because it might be obvious to a lot of you, but just bear with me. So this is one of the biggest humanitarian crises of our time. In 2016, just last year, the UN identified over 13 million people in Syria needing help. Most of these are internally displaced within Syria, but we have over 4 million, over 4.8 million refugees. Who hosts them? So basically, Syria's neighbors are the ones that are kind of bearing the brunt of this. And Turkey, with 2.7 million refugees, is really the top country in terms of receiving refugees, hosting refugees, but also sending aid to Syria. We have industrialized democracies are doing some part. And then I put the US here at the end because it has committed to resettling about 10,000 Syrian refugees. We have now reached that. And we don't see this going anywhere given the current political situation. Alongside this, there's been a rise in anti-refugee sentiment, and specifically in anti-Muslim sentiment. And here, this is just so obvious. I can pick any quote from Donald Trump's campaign. And this is one of the things that I think he either tweeted or said on the campaign trail. Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States, and he actually has tried to do that since becoming president, but that has been shut down by the Supreme Court, by the courts, sorry. So Syria is clearly an important, a politically salient case. We also think it's a useful case for research design in that you have both Christian and Muslim refugees coming out of Syria. They're mostly Muslim, but you also have Christian refugees. And so what we can do when we analyze people's attitudes towards Syrian refugees is we can hold constant the refugees' nationality, but then manipulate the refugees' religious identity and see how people respond to Christian versus Muslim Syrian refugees, and then identify whether there's a penalty for being Muslim. All right, so what do we want to know? 3 things. We want to know what types of refugees the American public prefers. We want to know what types of rhetorical mechanisms work. So here we're going to test 2 of Aristotle's 3 categories. We're going to use an argument based on logic, and then we're going to use a mechanism based on empathy. And then the third thing we want to know is what type of respondents respond. So you imagine that certain types of people will be more responsive to our message than others. And we're going to explore that. I'm going to give you a very quick preview of the findings. So, not surprising, Americans prefer refugees who can more easily integrate in the labor market. On one hand, it's not surprising. On the other hand, you can imagine that this could go either way. You can imagine that people would prefer refugees who are more likely to be vulnerable, women and children, right? To people who are more likely to be dependents. This is not the case in what we found. We found that Americans prefer middle-aged, professionalized Christian men who speak English well. All right, and I'll show you. I'll go into these in detail. We also find that empathy works pretty well in terms of increasing inclusion for people who identify their partisanship as either independent or Democrats, but our information mechanism does not. So remember, we have these two mechanisms of persuasion that we're testing: empathy, information. Empathy seems to work for independents and Democrats. Information does not. In addition, empathy seems to nudge Democrats to act on their positive attitudes. So it's not just what people are telling us in a survey. We actually ask them to take action and write a letter to the President of the United States, and Democrats are more likely to do that, to express their support for admitting Syrian refugees when they hear an empathy message. Information, we did not expect this, but there's also a little bit of backlash that's being created by our messages. And it's mostly coming from the information message. The information message, and to a lesser extent the empathy message, increased backlash among Republicans. When we look back on this today, we think this is not surprising. We could have maybe expected that. But back when we did this in October, November, we weren't sure. And then it's unclear whether these effects persist in time. All right, so this is a preview of our findings. So now let me talk a little bit about the design. How do we get to these findings? So we did a survey experiment of 5,400 respondents in October and November of 2016, just weeks before the presidential election. So this is before we knew who was going to be the next president. And this is a representative sample of US citizens. The survey has different parts. First, we ask people some questions about just the sociodemographic characteristics, their age, were they born in the US, their gender, their occupation, their education level, and then some measures of ethnocentrism. So these are questions that get at how ethnocentric somebody is. For example, do you believe that diversity is a good thing? Those kinds of things. So you get a sense of people's baseline levels of how open they are or not. We then gave them our treatment, and I'm going to go into detail as to what those are. We have 2 treatments and 1 control. So one group of people did not get the treatment. One group of people got our empathy treatment, and one group of people got our information treatment. We then present them with 3 pairs of conjoints. I'm going to go through what that is. It basically asks people to choose, to imagine that they are a US official choosing between 2 refugees. And we describe the refugees to them, and we ask them to choose which refugee they would pick. And then we also collect some other outcome variables, which I'll go into detail. There's 2 waves. So here's our sample. We randomly assign people to either the control, the information treatment, or the empathy treatment. And then in each of these groups, some people take the full survey right away. And then another group of people will take the first part of the survey right away, and then the second part 8 days later. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to see whether our messages, our persuasion messages, work if there's some time in between, right? So what is our empathy message? So here, we can't forcefully instill empathy. I can't force you to be more empathetic, but I can try. And so the way that we did this is we looked up, we did kind of a search online for NGOs that are trying to do this work. And what we found is, the most compelling thing we found was an NGO called the Pulitzer Center. And they support journalism, they support outreach on what they call underreported global issues. And refugees and attitudes towards refugees is one of those underreported global issues. So what they do in this, what the NGO does is they have these lesson plans that educators can use. And these lesson plans encourage people to engage in perspective taking. So imagine that you are a refugee, right? So we asked our respondents the following. Imagine you are a refugee fleeing persecution in a war-torn country. What would you take with you? Where would you flee to? And what do you feel would be the biggest challenge for you? And we had them answer these questions, right? Surprisingly, everybody answered these questions. We're still going through the answers to see if people just, typed on the keyboard meaninglessly. But so far, we know that nobody skipped these questions. The people who were given these questions actually wrote something in response. Alternatively, we gave our respondents an information message instead of an empathy message, right? So here we're testing whether people are just misinformed about refugees. They make their decisions based on cues, or shortcuts. They see the political leader that they like. They see his or her opinion about refugees, and they adopt that opinion. So maybe they're misinformed, or maybe they don't have enough information. So let us give you more information. And here's the information we gave them. We just gave them a graph. What this graph shows, sorry if you can't see in the back, is the number of Syrian refugees each country has committed to resettling. And here we've showing Canada. So Canada, you guys are at the top here. Then France, and this is per capita. Right? So Canada, then France, and Germany, and then the US. So what we show, and these are real numbers, is just, I mean, you can see, I think this graph is pretty stark in showing just how much the US is lagging behind countries that are also industrialized democracies. So that's all we did. We just showed them this graph. We didn't say anything else. And we also asked them if this was new information for them, right, and what they previously believed. So we tried to figure out if this was new material or not. Okay, so we give them these treatments. So again, a third of our sample doesn't get anything. A third gets the empathy treatment, and a third gets that graph, the information treatment. And then everybody gets a conjoint experiment. So a conjoint experiment is an experiment where people see descriptions of pairs of Syrian refugees next to each other, and the descriptors are randomly assigned. So here's what we did. Here's the information we gave them about these pairs of refugees. I'm going to show you a screenshot in a second where you'll get to see what they actually saw on the screen. But we randomly assigned whether the refugee was a man or a woman, Christian, Muslim, what their previous occupation was, so from unskilled, less skilled farmer, medium-skilled teacher to high-skilled doctor, their English fluency, so are they fluent, do they speak broken English, or did they have to speak English through an interpreter, and then their age. The fact that we randomize these things in red here allows us to isolate the effect of each of these things. So I can then tell you gender matters, or gender doesn't matter, holding these other things equal. Okay. This is a screenshot. This is what they saw. Refugee 1, refugee 2. You'll notice the first row says Syria. We really wanted to emphasize that these are all Syrian refugees. So this never changed. It always said Syria, right? And here is an example of what one respondent actually saw, right? So refugee 1 is a Syrian woman. She's Muslim. She was previously a farmer. She speaks fluent English, and she's 60 years old. Versus the other refugee, also a woman, Syrian woman, Muslim. She was previously a teacher. She also speaks fluent English, and she's 60 years old. These are randomly assigned, so I have no control over what people saw. But we did this over and over again. Each respondent got 3 of these pairs. So we have a very large sample size, and we can get at these effects. And then we ask people questions. So here's what we asked them. We asked them to choose which refugee. So imagine that you're an official making decisions about which refugees to let into the United States. Please read the descriptions of the potential refugees carefully. These refugees all come from Syria. Please indicate which of the 2 Syrian refugees you would personally prefer to see admitted to the United States. Then we all, yes?
Can they just say both of them or both of them?
They had to choose one. And some people didn't like that. Right? We have some open-ended answers at the end, what they felt about the survey, and some people did not like that they were forced to choose. But we also, in addition to that, we asked them to rate each refugee. Right? So now they don't have to choose anymore. We asked them on a scale from 1 to 7, where 1 indicates the US should absolutely not admit the refugee, and 7 indicates the US should definitely admit the refugee. How would you rate refugee 1, and how would you rate refugee 2? So they did get a chance. If they, first they have to choose, but let's say they don't like either refugee, they could give each a 1. Then we did a little something more here. So the problem with surveys is people will tell you something in a survey, but how do you know that it's not just cheap talk? Or how do you know that they not just trying to appear tolerant, right? So we tried to give them, we tried to get them to do something a little bit more costly that would take a little bit more time. we told them that, we truthfully told them that we would give them an opportunity to send a comment to the next president of the United States. We didn't know who it was at the time. And it would be anonymous. And we asked them, would they be willing to write a letter supporting admitting Syrian refugees to the US. So it was supposed to be a positive letter in support of admitting Syrian refugees. So we asked them, are you willing to do this? And if they said yes, we gave them just a text box where they could write. I have some data later about how many people chose to do this, but it was more than we expected. And then another behavioral measure, we asked them to describe the survey to a friend. So we wanted to see how they felt about the survey. And we have some interesting results there. Okay, so let's go to the first result. Americans prefer refugees who can more easily integrate in the labor market. All right. So here what this shows you is, recall that we ask people to rate refugees from 1 to 7. Okay, so this x-axis here is the average rating for the refugee. 4, we draw a line through 4. That's the middle, right? And what you see is, on average, how well each characteristic does. So, for example, here what you see is that when a refugee speaks fluent English, they get much higher ratings than when a refugee speaks English through an interpreter. Okay, these are just error bars, and 95% confidence intervals. Here, men do better than women. Before the fact, we wouldn't have guessed that necessarily. When it comes to refugees, we thought maybe women would be preferred. Doctors do better than farmers, so high skilled. And then unsurprisingly, the biggest gap is Christians versus Muslims. Christians do better than Muslims, right? And what you can see here is that these are the causal effects. We are isolating these. We are holding everything else constant about the refugee. This is the difference between Muslim and Christian. And another thing that I found really interesting in these results is that this preference cuts across party lines. So here what we have are Republicans in red, independents in green, and Democrats in blue. So it's exactly the same thing. We just cut it up by people's identification in terms of partisanship. And what you find, first of all, here's that middle line. So Republicans are on average below average, or they give refugees below average ratings. It's not surprising. But I think that the interesting result here is that the patterns are the same across the 3 colors. So even if you're a Democrat and you're much more tolerant on average, or you're much more open to refugees on average, you still prefer Christians to Muslims. Right? So there's still that gap. Right? It's a smaller gap, right? This is a smaller gap than the Republicans, but there still is a gap. I would say that these results are very much consistent with other results that other scholars have found in terms of people's preferences towards immigrants in the US and people's preferences towards refugees in Europe. So we've had similar studies for attitudes towards immigrants in the US and attitudes towards refugees in Europe, and they're very similar. So that's our first result. Our second result, now let's look at our persuasion messages. Let's look at empathy and whether it worked or not, and for who. All right, so here's how to interpret this. The line through 0 means that there's no effect of our empathy message on how you score a refugee, all right? So whenever a coefficient crosses the 0 line, that means we don't find an effect. That means that here, on average in our sample, the empathy message did not have a significant effect on people's ratings of refugees. It did not increase. I mean, it seems like it increased it, but there's too much uncertainty. The information message as well, no significant effect. So you look at the sample as a whole, there's no effect of our persuasion messages. But that's because the effects differ by people's partisanship, all right? So again, this is color-coded. The blue is Democrat, the green is independent, and the red is Republican. And what you find is the first 3 bars are the effects of our empathy message on Democrats, independents, and Republicans on how people rate refugees. So what we find here is that independents rate refugees more positively when they get the empathy message. Republicans rate refugees more negatively when they get the empathy message. The next 3 bars are the information message. Information doesn't do anything for Democrats or independents, very much lowers Republicans' refugee ratings. Okay?
Democrats is very close to being.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Here?
really odd, right?
There's a little bit of a backlash effect in general in terms of, I think sometimes people kind of saw through what we were trying to do and didn't like it. But this is not significant. We can't say that this is a negative effect. Another thing to note about Democrats, remember Democrats start out much higher, right, in refugee ratings. So there's a bit of a ceiling effect for Democrats. You can't go much higher when you're a Democrat because your ratings are already on average pretty high. So it's easier to see some downward movement. Okay, the Muslim penalty. What I call the Muslim penalty is holding everything equal. You take 2 refugees that are exactly the same. One is Muslim, one is Christian. Are you more likely to choose the Muslim or the Christian refugee, right? And as you saw before, people are systematically more likely to choose the Christian refugee over the Muslim refugee when we force them to choose. What happens when we give them an empathy message, or what happens when we give them an information message? Here's the 0 bar. So what we find is that both our empathy message and our information message for the whole sample, this is going to be confusing, decrease the Muslim penalty. This you should take as the probability of choosing a Muslim over a Christian. So if it's positive, that means there's less of a Muslim penalty. People are more likely to choose Muslims. Or they're less likely to discriminate against Muslims when they get those messages, right? And when we look by partisanship, it kind of cuts across partisanship. So you have a couple of insignificant effects here, but here's our empathy message on the Muslim penalty. What you see is it really works for Republicans here. Republicans are responding most strongly in a positive way when it comes to the Muslim penalty. All right? So there might be some glimmer of hope if your goal is to reduce Islamophobia or to reduce the Muslim penalty with these messages. Okay. So here's just a sense of magnitude. So these are just average refugee scores for the full sample in the control condition. So remember, this is between 1 to 7. In the empathy condition and then information condition. So these are not significant differences. But then also for Democrats, these are not significant effects. For independents, remember, I don't know if you remember, but I had shown you that there was a significant positive effect of the empathy message on independents. And then Republicans, significant lowering, right, from 3.92 to 3.75, 3.62, less favorable towards refugees when they get these treatments. Probability of choosing a Muslim profile is positive under the information message for the full sample. This is true for Democrats. It's true for independents for both empathy and information messages. And it's true for Republicans for both empathy and information messages. These are just levels of significance. The result on Republicans is quite robust. Okay. I think this is our most interesting finding, that empathy nudged Democrats to act on their positive priors. Because here now we're turning towards a behavioral measure. We're looking at what our respondents are doing that is more than just clicking a box in the survey. So we asked them, would you be willing to write to the next president of the United States in support of admitting Syrian refugees, right? And I'm just going to give you a sense of some of the responses that we got. The question asked them to write a supportive message. So some people said yes, and then they wrote a supportive message. So for example, a lot of people wrote what you find in the Statue of Liberty: give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of people wrote that message. You know, people express themselves freely. And then people just really took this very seriously. Dear POTUS, I express my support of refugees coming to the United States, especially the women and children. They need food and health care. Thanks so much. All right. It was also interesting to see, maybe this is a separate paper, how many people said, Dear President Clinton, and how many people said, Dear President Trump. People just assumed that they knew who was going to win. And then some people took this opportunity to write negative messages, even though that's not what we asked them. So they said, yes, I'm willing to write a supportive letter. And then when we gave them a chance to write the letter, here's what they wrote. I absolutely do not support accepting refugees into the US. We have people here who are suffering. Help Americans before you help everyone else. This was a very common theme. So I actually read all the responses. This was a very common theme that we saw, that we need to help our vets. We need to help our homeless. We need to help our own before we help others. We have enough problems. A lot of this too. I believe the next president should set aside an area. By the way, this is we copied this verbatim. So if you see typos, if you see mistakes, that's because that wasn't me. That's actually what they wrote. I believe the next president should set aside an area in Syria and help keep it safe and have the refugees reside there. That was another common theme. Right? Make a safe space for them in the Middle East, in Syria, near Syria. And then, there's also these messages that were often prejudiced. So here we are looking at the probability of writing a supportive letter. Okay, so I went through all of these. My co-authors went through all of these. We coded all of these as supportive or not supportive. And what we find is, here's the zero line right here. For the empathy message, we have a positive effect for the whole sample. All right? Information is pretty much zero effect. Right, so the respondents who got the empathy message were more likely to write a positive letter, anonymous letter to the 45th president of the United States. This is driven by Democrats. So here, the first three is the empathy message on Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And what we have is a very strong effect for Democrats. Nothing with independents. We do have a positive coefficient here. It's not statistically significant. And then for the information message, we don't have any significant effects. So just to give you a sense of the magnitudes of these effects, so for the full sample in the control condition, so people who didn't see any persuasion message, about just under 17% of people wrote a positive letter. For the people who saw the empathy message, this goes up to 21% of people wrote a positive letter. And then in the information message, as you can see, there's really no difference here.
So,
yeah.
Quick question. Did you exclude the people who didn't write a letter?
Yeah. So those are well, no, those are zeros, right? Because we asked, are you willing to write a letter? And they said no, so those are coded as zero. So in the zero, we have the people who were not willing to write a letter and the people who wrote a negative letter. And then as I've shown you before, this effect is really driven by the Democrats getting the empathy message. You go from a 23% probability of writing a positive letter to 34%. So this is a pretty big jump. And then no effect for information. Nothing really going on with the independents. There's a slightly lower probability under the information message, but it's not a statistically significant change. And there isn't really anything going on with Republicans at all. You'll notice also just how this matches our expectations, right? Only 4.5% of Republicans were writing a positive letter in the control condition compared to 23% of Democrats and 21% of independents. So this backlash effect, this is not something we expected, but it's something that the results are telling us, and that we need to do a little bit more analysis to really be sure of this. But this is something that we're seeing here in the data, that information, mostly the information treatment, but also to some extent the empathy treatment, increased backlash from Republicans. All right, so I've shown you this before. I'm showing it again because we're back to looking at the ratings of refugees, I want to highlight again this negative effect for Republicans. Whether you got you're a Republican getting the empathy message or you're a Republican getting the information message, you give lower ratings to refugees than if you got no message at all. And here's another test that we did to find out if there was backlash. We looked at this question of describing the survey to a friend, right? So people took the time to describe that, to describe the survey, and some people wrote messages that were quite objective and actually quite accurate. The purpose of the survey the purpose of the survey was, quote, to determine general views towards Syrian refugees. That's one example. Or to investigate the rationale behind people's opinions toward refugees. Or to try to guilt trip people who oppose open borders and open immigration. Or Muslims do not assimilate. So this person didn't even answer a question, right? They just repeated their beliefs, all right, which happen to be Islamophobic here. All right. So we have a number of people who took this opportunity to express either their displeasure with the survey, who thought that we were working for Hillary Clinton and we're going to misrepresent the results. We got some of that. Or who repeated anti-Muslim rhetoric, or who criticized President Obama's policies. So those people were coded as backlash. All right, these are people who were not happy. So here's the average in the sample, the full sample, everybody. What we find is the people who got the empathy treatment, they're not more likely to express backlash. And in information, it's positive, but it's not statistically significant. So we don't know yet. When we break it down by party ID, what we find is that the red is Republicans, this is Democrats, this is independents. What we find is that this is a significant effect right there, that the information message increased the likelihood that Republicans wrote a negative message when they were describing the survey to a friend. So increased the likelihood of backlash. Right. So back to the magnitudes. So these are the probabilities of a backlash letter. Pretty small in the full sample. We're talking about 5%, 5.5% of our sample expressed back just negative feelings towards the survey. And nothing going on really with the Democrats. Nothing going on really with the independents. What you see here is the Republicans who got the information message, right? So 10% of Republicans in the control condition were likely to express backlash, and this jumps up to 17% when they got the information message. The final thing, I don't know if you remember, I said at the beginning that we had 2 waves of respondents. So we're able to see whether these effects persist in time. So the way that this works is that a random half of our sample took one survey, right? So they got the persuasion messages, and then right away we asked them these questions. The other random half of our sample, they got these persuasion messages, the survey ended. 8 days later, they're recontacted by the survey company for another survey which asks them our outcomes, right? There was no link made between the 2 surveys. Right? So it's as if they had taken 2 different surveys. Right? So we're able to get to look to see if people's behaviors and attitudes towards Syrian refugees are affected by treatments that they got 7 days before. Unfortunately for us, no. Okay. So what this graph shows you, is the effects in wave 1 and the effects in wave 2. For our various outcomes. So this is the Muslim penalty, this is the refugee rating, and this is the letter writing. And the top 3 panels are the empathy treatment, the bottom 3 panels are the information treatment. That is that positive effect on empathy on letter writing. In wave 1, it disappears in wave 2. Right? So 8 days later, we don't have effects. Why is that? Well, we have some ideas. We have some justifications. The people who were taking the survey 8 days later, they were taking the survey about 4 or 5 days before the election. Right? So we think that there was a lot going on. There was a lot of campaigning, a lot of messaging going on. And whatever we told them 8 days before in a survey that they took at midnight, maybe, well, with a glass of wine, might have been forgotten. Okay? Another thing is, there's a lot of graphs here. What I want to show you is we looked at whether there was a shift in people's attitudes over time. And what we find is that Democrats, over time, so in the second wave, in the control condition, they were more likely to write letters to the president. So this is this graph right here. This is wave one. These are Democrats' willingness to write a letter to the president in the control condition. These are people who didn't get any persuasion message. You see that this goes up in wave two, and it's a significant increase. So that means that as we got closer to the election, Democrats were generally more willing to be active, to be politically active, to write letters to the president. And so any effect that our persuasion messages might have had would be difficult for us to find if already at the baseline they're willing to participate. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Was there some oppression?
Sorry?
Was there some oppression?
Was there what?
I mean, some people who did not respond 7 days later.
So yes, but I don't have that data because we have to get it from the survey company. Right?
But do you know the number?
Sorry?
Do you know the number?
I don't have that number, but I do. I have it at home. I haven't done the analysis. So this is going to go into our next steps. We have more things that we can do. All right, so just to summarize, we find that both of our treatments can improve American attitudes towards refugees, and particularly towards Muslim refugees. But party is a key mediator here. It seems to work for Democrats and independents when we're talking about refugee ratings. When we're talking about the Muslim penalty, it actually seems to work with Republicans. But I don't want to be very optimistic here because, again, this is just what people are saying in a survey. And we worry that there's a little bit of social desirability bias going on, which is that the respondents they've guessed what we're trying to do, and they're telling us what they think we want them to hear. They're telling us what they think we want to hear. Okay? And so that's why I tend to trust the behavioral measures more, right? Measures where people actually had to spend some time and write a letter. I trust that more than I trust just checking a box on the survey. We also have evidence that the Republicans who got our information message, they were more likely to choose Muslims over Christians than before, but they were also more likely to dislike our survey. So what you have is the data are telling me that these Republicans, they were pushed by our message to lower their Islamophobia, but then they didn't like it. They didn't like our survey. They weren't happy with us. Okay? So I'm not sure that this is a very optimistic result. I think this is more optimistic, where you have Democrats who already have pretty high attitudes towards refugees, so it's hard to move them even higher, but you can get them to act on these positive attitudes. You can, with an empathy message, you can get them to write a letter to the next president. We need to be careful with, especially with our information message that seems to have created a backlash for Republicans. And so the conclusion so far is that we do think that inclusion can be increased in a meaningful way. And here we're talking about what we're finding on Democrats, but we need to be really careful and sensitive to the type of respondent we're talking to and the type of encouragement, empathy versus information. We do have another way to test backlash, and we will be doing this in the future, which is we have data on people dropping out of the survey. Right? So who dropped out of the survey and at what point did they drop out of the survey? And so if we can, what I expect to see is that Republicans, once they get that information message, I expect them to be more likely to just close the survey, right? Which which I think would be pretty informative if what you're trying to do is increase inclusion and positive attitudes. All right, that's it. Thank you.